Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Nikki, Lynn and Anne, Nick, and Steve. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, full books, and collections found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's return to a remarkable work of history written by an author better known for his fiction. We're reading A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells, first published in 1922 by the Macmillan and Company, New York. Let's pick up right where we left off at chapter 34. Let's begin. Chapter 34: Between Rome and China. The 2nd and 1st centuries BC mark a new phase in the history of mankind. Mesopotamia and the Eastern Mediterranean are no longer the center of interest. Both Mesopotamia and Egypt were still fertile, populous, and fairly prosperous, but they were no longer the dominant regions of the world. Power had drifted to the west and to the east. Two great empires now dominated the world: this new Roman Empire and the renascent Empire of China. Rome extended its power to the Euphrates, but it was never able to get beyond that boundary. It was too remote. Beyond the Euphrates, the former Persian and Indian dominions of the Seleucids fell under a number of new masters. China, now under the Han dynasty, which had replaced the Qin dynasty at the death of Shi Huangti, had extended its power across Tibet and over the high mountain passes of the Pamirs into western Turkestan. But there too it reached its extremes. Beyond was too far. China at this time was the greatest, best organized, and most civilized political system in the world. It was superior in area and population to the Roman Empire at its zenith. It was possible then for these two vast systems to flourish in the same world at the same time, in almost complete ignorance of each other. The means of communication both by sea and land was not yet sufficiently developed and organized for them to come to a direct clash. Yet they reacted upon each other in a very remarkable way, and their influence upon the fate of the regions that lay between them, upon Central Asia and India, was profound. A certain amount of trade trickled through, by camel caravans across Persia, for example, and by coasting ships by way of India and the Red Sea. In 66 BC, Roman troops under Pompey followed in the footsteps of Alexander the Great and marched up the eastern shores of the Caspian Sea. In 102 AD, a Chinese expeditionary force under Pan Chao reached the Caspian and sent emissaries to report upon the power of Rome. But many centuries were still to pass before definite knowledge and direct intercourse were to link the great parallel worlds of Europe and Eastern Asia. To the north of both these great empires were barbaric wildernesses. What is now Germany was largely forest lands. The forests extended far into Russia and made a home for the gigantic aurochs, a bull of almost elephantine size. Then to the north of the great mountain masses of Asia stretched a band of deserts, steppes, and then forests and frozen lands. In the eastward lap of the elevated part of Asia was the great triangle of Manchuria. Large parts of these regions, stretching between South Russia and Turkestan into Manchuria, were and are regions of exceptional climatic insecurity. Their rainfall has varied greatly in the course of a few centuries. They are lands treacherous to man. For years they will carry pasture and sustain cultivation, and then will come an age of decline in humidity and a cycle of killing droughts. The western part of this barbaric north, from the German forest to South Russia and Turkestan, and from Gothland to the Alps, was the region of origin of the Nordic peoples and of the Aryan speech. The eastern steppes and deserts of Mongolia was the region of origin of the Hunnish or Mongolian or Tartar or Turkish peoples, for all these several peoples were akin in language, race, and way of life. And as the Nordic peoples seem to have been continually overflowing their own borders and pressing south upon the developing civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast, so the Hunnish tribes sent their surplus as wanderers, raiders, and conquerors into the settled regions of China. Periods of plenty in the north would mean an increase in population there. A shortage of grass, a spell of cattle disease, would drive the hungry, warlike tribesmen south. For a time there were simultaneously two fairly effective empires in the world, capable of holding back the barbarians and even forcing forward the frontiers of the imperial peace. The thrust of the Han Empire from North China into Mongolia was strong and continuous. The Chinese population welled up over the barrier of the Great Wall. Behind the imperial frontier guards came the Chinese farmer with horse and plow, plowing up the grasslands and enclosing the winter pasture. The Hunnish peoples raided and murdered the settlers, but the Chinese punitive expeditions were too much for them. The nomads were faced with the choice of settling down to the plow and becoming Chinese taxpayers, or shifting in search of fresh summer pasture. Some took the former course and were absorbed. Some drifted northeastward and eastward over the mountain passes down into western Turkestan. This westward drive of the Mongolian horsemen was going on from 200 BC onward. It was producing a westward pressure upon the Aryan tribes, and these again were pressing upon the Roman frontiers, ready to break through directly there was any weakness apparent. The Parthians, who were apparently a Scythian people with some Mongolian admixture, came down to the Euphrates by the 1st century BC. They fought against Pompey the Great in his eastern raid. They defeated and killed Crassus. They replaced the Seleucid monarchy in Persia by a dynasty of Parthian kings, the Arsacid dynasty. But for a time, the line of least resistance for hungry nomads lay neither to the west nor the east, but through Central Asia and then southeastward through the Khyber Pass into India. It was India which received the Mongolian drive in these centuries of Roman and Chinese strength. A series of raiding conquerors poured down through the Punjab into the Great Plains to loot and destroy. The empire of Asoka was broken up, and for a time the history of India passes into darkness. A certain Kushan dynasty, founded by the Indo-Scythians, one of the raiding peoples, ruled for a time over North India and maintained a certain order. These invasions went on for several centuries. For a large part of the 5th century AD, India was afflicted by the Ephthalites, or White Huns, who levied tribute on the small Indian princes and held India in terror. Every summer these Ephthalites pastured in western Turkestan. Every autumn they came down through the passes to terrorize India. In the 2nd century AD, a great misfortune came upon the Roman and Chinese empires that probably weakened the resistance of both to barbarian pressure. This was a pestilence of unexampled virulence. It raged for 11 years in China and disorganized the social framework profoundly. The Han dynasty fell, and a new age of division and confusion began, from which China did not fairly recover until the 7th century AD, with the coming of the great Tang dynasty. The infection spread through Asia to Europe. It raged throughout the Roman Empire from 164 to 180 AD. It evidently weakened the Roman imperial fabric very seriously. We begin to hear of depopulation in the Roman provinces after this, and there was a marked deterioration in the vigor and efficiency of government. At any rate, we presently find the frontier no longer invulnerable, but giving way, first in this place and then in that. A new Nordic people, the Goths, coming originally from Gothland in Sweden, had migrated across Russia to the Volga region and the shores of the Black Sea and taken to the sea and piracy. By the end of the 2nd century, they may have begun to feel the westward thrust of the Huns. In 247, they crossed the Danube in a great land raid and defeated and killed the Emperor Decius in a battle in what is now Serbia. In 236, another Germanic people, the Franks, had broken bounds upon the lower Rhine, and the Alemanni had poured into Alsace. The legions in Gaul beat back their invaders, but the Goths in the Balkan Peninsula raided again and again. The province of Dacia vanished from Roman history. A chill had come to the pride and confidence of Rome. In 270 to 275, Rome, which had been an open and secure city for 3 centuries, was fortified by the Emperor Aurelian. Chapter 35: The Common Man's Life Under the Early Roman Empire. Before we tell of how this Roman Empire, which was built up in the 2 centuries BC, and which flourished in peace and security from the days of Augustus Caesar onward for 2 centuries, fell into disorder and was broken up, it may be as well to devote some attention to the life of the ordinary people throughout this great realm. Our history has come down now to within 2,000 years of our own time, and the life of the civilized people, both under the peace of Rome and the peace of the Han dynasty, was beginning to resemble more and more clearly the life of their civilized successors today. In the Western world, coined money was now in common use. Outside the priestly world, there were many people of independent means who were neither officials of the government nor priests. People traveled about more freely than they had ever done before, and there were high roads and inns for them. Compared with the past, with the time before 500 BC, life had become much more loose. Before that date, civilized men had been bound to a district or country, had been bound to a tradition, and lived within a very limited horizon. Only the nomads traded and traveled. But neither the Roman peace nor the peace of the Han dynasty meant a uniform civilization over the large areas they controlled. There were very great local differences and great contrasts and inequalities of culture between one district and another, just as there are today under the British peace in India. The Roman garrisons and colonies were dotted here and there over this great space, worshipping Roman gods and speaking the Latin language. But where there had been towns and cities before the coming of the Romans, they went on, subordinated indeed, but managing their own affairs, and for a time at least, worshipping their own gods in their own fashion. Over Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Hellenized East generally, the Latin language never prevailed. Greek ruled there invincibly. Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul, was a Jew and a Roman citizen, but he spoke and wrote Greek and not Hebrew. Even at the court of the Parthian dynasty, which had overthrown the Greek Seleucids in Persia, and was quite outside the Roman imperial boundaries, Greek was the fashionable language. In some parts of Spain and in North Africa, the Carthaginian language also held on for a long time in spite of the destruction of Carthage. Such a town as Seville, which had been a prosperous city long before the Roman name had been heard of, kept its Semitic goddess and preserved its Semitic speech for generations, in spite of a colony of Roman veterans at Italica a few miles away. Septimius Severus, who was emperor from 193 to 211 AD, spoke Carthaginian as his mother speech. He learnt Latin later as a foreign tongue, and it is recorded that his sister never learnt Latin and conducted her Roman household in the Punic language. In such countries as Gaul and Britain, and in provinces like Dacia, now roughly Romania, and Pannonia, Hungary south of the Danube, where there were no pre-existing great cities and temples and cultures, the Roman Empire did, however, Latinize. It civilized these countries for the first time. It created cities and towns where Latin was from the first the dominant speech, and where Roman gods were served, and Roman customs and fashions followed. The Romanian, Italian, French, and Spanish languages, all variations and modifications of Latin, remain to remind us of this extension of Latin speech and customs. Northwest Africa also became at last largely Latin-speaking. Egypt, Greece, and the rest of the empire to the east were never Latinized. They remained Egyptian and Greek in culture and spirit. And even in Rome, among educated men, Greek was learnt as the language of a gentleman, and Greek literature and learning were very properly preferred to Latin. In this miscellaneous empire, the ways of doing work and business were naturally also very miscellaneous. The chief industry of the settled world was still largely agriculture. We have told how in Italy the sturdy free farmers who were the backbone of the early Roman Republic were replaced by estates worked by slave labor after the Punic Wars. The Greek world had had very various methods of cultivation, from the Arcadian plan, wherein every free citizen toiled with his own hands, to Sparta, wherein it was a dishonor to work, and where agricultural work was done by a special slave class, the Helots. But that was ancient history now, and over most of the Hellenized world, the estate system and slave gangs had spread. The agricultural slaves were captives who spoke many different languages so that they could not understand each other, or they were born slaves. They had no solidarity to resist oppression, no tradition of rights, no knowledge, for they could not read nor write. Although they came to form a majority of the country population, they never made a successful insurrection. The insurrection of Spartacus in the 1st century BC was an insurrection of the special slaves who were trained for the gladiatorial combats. The agricultural workers in Italy in the latter days of the Republic and the early Empire suffered frightful indignities. They would be chained at night to prevent escape, or have half the head shaved to make it difficult. They had no wives of their own. They could be outraged, mutilated, and killed by their masters. A master could sell his slave to fight beasts in the arena. If a slave slew his master, all the slaves in the household, and not merely the murderer, were crucified. In some parts of Greece, in Athens notably, the lot of the slave was never quite so frightful as this, but it was still detestable. To such a population, the barbarian invaders who presently broke through the defensive line of the legions came not as enemies, but as liberators. The slave system had spread to most industries and to every sort of work that could be done by gangs. Mines and metallurgical operations, the rowing of galleys, road making, and big building operations were all largely slave occupations, and almost all domestic service was performed by slaves. There were poor freemen, and there were freedmen in the cities and upon the countryside, working for themselves or even working for wages. They were artisans, supervisors, and so forth, workers of a new money-paid class, working in competition with slave workers. But we do not know what proportion they made of the general population. It probably varied widely in different places and at different periods. And there were also many modifications of slavery, from the slavery that was chained at night and driven with whips, to the farm or quarry, to the slave whose master found it advantageous to leave him to cultivate his patch or work his craft and own his wife like a free man, provided he paid in a satisfactory quittance to his owner. There were armed slaves. At the opening of the period of the Punic Wars in 264 BC, the Etruscan sport of setting slaves to fight for their lives was revived in Rome. It grew rapidly fashionable, and soon every great Roman rich man kept a retinue of gladiators, who sometimes fought in the arena, but whose real business it was to act as his bodyguard of bullies. And also there were learned slaves. The conquests of the later Republic were among the highly civilized cities of Greece, North Africa, and Asia Minor, and they brought in many highly educated captives. The tutor of a young Roman of good family was usually a slave. A rich man would have a Greek slave as librarian, and slave secretaries and learned men. He would keep his poet as he would keep a performing dog. In this atmosphere of slavery, the traditions of modern literary criticism were evolved. The slaves still boast and quarrel in our reviews. There were enterprising people who bought intelligent boy slaves and had them educated for sale. Slaves were trained as book copyists, as jewelers, and for endless skilled callings. But there were very considerable changes in the position of a slave during the 400 years between the opening days of conquest under the Republic of Rich Men and the days of disintegration that followed the Great Pestilence. In the 2nd century BC, war captives were abundant, manners gross and brutal. The slave had no rights, and there was scarcely an outrage the reader can imagine that was not practiced upon slaves in those days. But already in the 1st century AD, there was a perceptible improvement in the attitude of the Roman civilization towards slavery. Captives were not so abundant for one thing, and slaves were dearer, and slave owners began to realize that the profit and comfort they got from their slaves increased with the self-respect of these unfortunates. But also, the moral tone of the community was rising, and a sense of justice was becoming effective. The higher mentality of Greece was qualifying the old Roman harshness. Restrictions upon cruelty were made. A master might no longer sell his slave to fight beasts. A slave was given property rights in what was called his peculium. Slaves were paid wages as an encouragement and stimulus. A form of slave marriage was recognized. Very many forms of agriculture do not lend themselves to gang working, or require gang workers only at certain seasons. In regions where such conditions prevailed, the slave presently became a serf, paying his owner part of his produce, or working for him at certain seasons. When we begin to realize how essentially this great Latin and Greek-speaking Roman Empire of the first 2 centuries AD was a slave state, and how small was the minority who had any pride or freedom in their lives, we lay our hands on the clues to its decay and collapse. There was little of what we should call family life. Few homes of temperate living and active thought and study. Schools and colleges were few and far between. The free will and the free mind were nowhere to be found. The great roads, the ruins of splendid buildings, the tradition of law and power it left for the astonishment of succeeding generations, must not conceal from us that all its outer splendor was built upon thwarted wills, stifled intelligence, and crippled and perverted desires. And even the minority who lorded it over that wide realm of subjugation and of restraint and forced labor were uneasy and unhappy in their souls. Art and literature, science and philosophy, which are the fruits of free and happy minds, waned in that atmosphere. There was much copying and imitation, an abundance of artistic artificers, much slavish pedantry among the servile men of learning. But the whole Roman Empire in 4 centuries produced nothing to set beside the bold and noble intellectual activities of the comparatively little city of Athens during its 1 century of greatness. Athens decayed under the Roman scepter. The science of Alexandria decayed. The spirit of man, it seemed, was decaying in those days. Chapter 36. Religious Developments under the Roman Empire. The soul of man under the Latin and Greek Empire of the first 2 centuries of the Christian era was a worried and frustrated soul. Compulsion and cruelty reigned. There were pride and display, but little honor, little serenity or steadfast happiness. The unfortunate were despised and wretched. The fortunate were insecure and feverishly eager for gratifications. In a great number of cities, life centered on the red excitement of the arena, where men and beasts fought and were tormented and slain. Amphitheaters are the most characteristic of Roman ruins. Life went on in that key. The uneasiness of men's hearts manifested itself in profound religious unrest. From the days when the Aryan hordes first broke in upon the ancient civilizations, it was inevitable that the old gods of the temples and priesthoods should suffer great adaptations or disappear. In the course of hundreds of generations, the agricultural peoples of the brunette civilizations had shaped their lives and thoughts to the temple-centered life. Observances and the fear of disturbed routines, sacrifices and mysteries dominated their minds. Their gods seem monstrous and illogical to our modern minds, but to these older peoples, these deities had the immediate conviction and vividness of things seen in an intense dream. The conquest of one city-state by another in Samaria or early Egypt meant a change or a renaming of gods or goddesses, but left the shape and spirit of the worship intact. There was no change in its general character. The figures in the dream changed, but the dream went on, and it was the same sort of dream. And the early Semitic conquerors were sufficiently akin in spirit to the Sumerians to take over the religion of the Mesopotamian civilization they subjugated without any profound alteration. Egypt was never indeed subjugated to the extent of a religious revolution. Under the Ptolemies and under the Caesars, her temples and altars and priesthoods remained essentially Egyptian. So long as conquest went on between people of similar social and religious habits, it was possible to get over the clash between the god of this temple and region and the god of that by a process of grouping or assimilation. If the two gods were alike in character, they were identified. It was really the same god under another name, said the priests and the people. This fusion of gods is called theocratia, and the age of the great conquest of the 1,000 years BC was an age of theocratia. Over wide areas, the local gods were displaced by, or rather, they were swallowed up in, a general god. So that when at last Hebrew prophets in Babylon proclaimed one God of righteousness in all the earth, men's minds were fully prepared for that idea. But often the gods were too dissimilar for such an assimilation, and then they were grouped together in some plausible relationship. A female god, and the Aegean world before the coming of the Greek was much addicted to mother gods, would be married to a male god, and an animal god or a star god would be humanized, and the animal or astronomical aspect, the serpent or the sun or the star, made into an ornament or a symbol, or the god of a defeated people would become a malignant antagonist to the brighter gods. The history of theology is full of such adaptations, compromises, and rationalizations of once local gods. As Egypt developed from city-states into one united kingdom, there was much of this theocratia. The chief god, so to speak, was Osiris, a sacrificial harvest god, of whom Pharaoh was supposed to be the earthly incarnation. Osiris was represented as repeatedly dying and rising again. He was not only the seed and the harvest, but also by a natural extension of thought, the means of human immortality. Among his symbols was the wide-winged scarabus beetle, which buries its eggs to rise again, and also the effulgent sun which sets to rise. Later on he was to be identified with Apis, the sacred bull. Associated with him was the goddess Isis. Isis was also Hathor, a cow goddess, and the crescent moon, and the star of the sea. Osiris dies, and she bears a child, Horus, who is also a hawk god and the dawn, and who grows to become Osiris again. The effigies of Isis represent her as bearing the infant Horus in her arms and standing on the crescent moon. These are not logical relationships, but they were devised by the human mind before the development of hard and systematic thinking, and they have a dreamlike coherence. Beneath this triple group, there are other and darker Egyptian gods, bad gods, the dog-headed Anubis, Black Night and the like, devourers, tempters, enemies of God and man. Every religious system does in the course of time fit itself to the shape of the human soul, and there can be no doubt that out of these illogical and even uncouth symbols, Egyptian people were able to fashion for themselves ways of genuine devotion and consolation. The desire for immortality was very strong in the Egyptian mind, and the religious life of Egypt turned on that desire. The Egyptian religion was an immortality religion, as no other religion had ever been. as Egypt went down under foreign conquerors and the Egyptian gods ceased to have any satisfactory political significance, this craving for a life of compensations hereafter intensified. After the Greek conquest, the new city of Alexandria became the center of Egyptian religious life, and indeed of the religious life of the whole Hellenic world. A great temple, the Serapeum, was set up by Ptolemy I, at which a sort of trinity of gods was worshipped. These were Serapis, who was Osiris Apis rechristened, Isis, and Horus. These were not regarded as separate gods, but as three aspects of one god. And Serapis was identified with the Greek Zeus, the Roman Jupiter, and the Persian sun god. This worship spread wherever the Hellenic influence extended, even into North India and Western China. The idea of immortality, an immortality of compensations and consolation, was eagerly received by a world in which the common life was hopelessly wretched. Serapis was called the Savior of Souls. After death, said the hymns of that time, we are still in the care of his providence. Isis attracted many devotees. Her images stood in her temples as Queen of Heaven, bearing the infant Horus in her arms. Candles were burnt before her, votive offerings were made to her. Shaven priests, consecrated to celibacy, waited on her altar. The rise of the Roman Empire opened the Western European world to this growing cult. The temples of Serapis Isis, the chanting of the priests, and the hope of immortal life followed the Roman standards to Scotland and Holland. But there were many rivals to the Serapis Isis religion. Prominent among these was Mithraism. This was a religion of Persian origin, and it centered upon some now forgotten mysteries about Mithras sacrificing a sacred and benevolent bull. Here we seem to have something more primordial than the complicated and sophisticated Serapis Isis beliefs. We are carried back directly to the blood sacrifices of the Heliolithic stage in human culture. The bull upon the Mithraic monuments always bleeds copiously from a wound in its side, and from this blood springs new life. The votary to Mithraism actually bathed in the blood of the sacrificial bull. At his initiation, he went beneath the scaffolding upon which a bull was killed, so that the blood could actually run down on him. Both these religions, and the same is true of many other of the numerous parallel cults that sought the allegiance of the slaves and citizens under the earlier Roman emperors, are personal religions. They aim at personal salvation and personal immortality. The older religions were not personal like that. They were social. The older fashion of divinity was god or goddess of the city first, or of the state, and only secondarily of the individual. The sacrifices were a public and not a private function. They concerned collective practical needs in this world in which we live. But the Greeks first, and now the Romans, had pushed religion out of politics. Guided by the Egyptian tradition, religion had retreated to the other world. These new private immortality religions took all the heart and emotion out of the old state religions, but they did not actually replace them. A typical city under the earlier Roman emperors would have a number of temples to all sorts of gods. There might be a temple to Jupiter of the Capitol, the great god of Rome, and there would probably be one to the reigning Caesar, for the Caesars had learnt from the pharaohs the possibility of being gods. In such temples, a cold and stately political worship went on. One would go and make an offering, and burn a pinch of incense to show one's loyalty. But it would be to the temple of Isis, the dear Queen of Heaven, one would go with the burden of one's private troubles for advice and relief. There might be local and eccentric gods. Seville, for example, long affected the worship of the old Carthaginian Venus. In a cave or an underground temple, there would certainly be an altar to Mithras, attended by legionaries and slaves. And probably also there would be a synagogue where the Jews gathered to read their Bible and uphold their faith in the unseen God of all the earth. Sometimes there would be trouble with the Jews about the political side of the state religion. They held that their God was a jealous God, intolerant of idolatry, and they would refuse to take part in the public sacrifices to Caesar. They would not even salute the Roman standards for fear of idolatry. In the East, long before the time of Buddha, there had been ascetics, men and women who gave up most of the delights of life, who repudiated marriage and property, and sought spiritual powers and an escape from the stresses and mortifications of the world in abstinence, pain, and solitude. Buddha himself set his face against ascetic extravagances, but many of his disciples followed a monkish life of great severity. Obscure Greek cults practiced similar disciplines, even to the extent of self-mutilation. Asceticism appeared in the Jewish communities of Judea and Alexandria also in the 1st century BC. Communities of men abandoned the world and gave themselves to austerities and mystical contemplation. Such was the sect of the Essenes. Throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, there was an almost worldwide resort to such repudiations of life, a universal search for salvation from the distresses of the time. The old sense of an established order, the old confidence in priest and temple, and law and custom had gone. Amidst the prevailing slavery, cruelty, fear, anxiety, waste, display, and hectic self-indulgence went this epidemic of self-disgust and mental insecurity. This agonized search for peace, even at the price of renunciation and voluntary suffering. This it was that filled the Serapeum with weeping penitence, and brought the converts into the gloom and gore of the Mithraic cave. And with the end of the chapter, and that rather interesting roundup of the evolution of religion, I think we'll end this evening's reading from A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. Once again, he managed to cram in a lot of history in a few pages, as well as some pretty concise looks at the development of thinking, which I always find fascinating. I hope you enjoyed that as well. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the illustrations it contains, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.